Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Subscription Scaled. I'm your host, Nick Frederick. With me today as co-host is Christy Beasley. And our guest today is Dan McCarthy, who is the Assistant Professor of Marketing at Emory University and the co-founder of Theta. Dan, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, I'm really excited to dive in today, focus on marketing and business valuation, which of course are your specialty areas. But let's start with your background and how you got into valuation, and especially as it relates to subscription.
Yeah, I got started with valuation because I've always kind of been a finance person at heart. I did my undergraduate at the Wharton School. I also got a degree in engineering, but I was by and large mostly just a finance person. I went out after graduating from Penn to work on the buy side at a hedge fund for about 6 years, and then came back for a PhD in statistics, also at the Wharton School.
Okay.
I'd say that background in finance is really what has kind of made it, just investments and valuation kind of a core part of what I've done since. So so kind of happy to talk through the rest of the history, but that's certainly what.
Yeah. Well, how does that parlay into marketing at Emory?
Yeah, you think how does that even follow, or even how does the statistics PhD follow?
Right.
Yeah, and I'd always been a numbers person, and certainly the sort of work that we did at the fund, it was a combination of quantitative analysis and fundamental analysis. So, so I'd always kind of continue to stay very close to my work on the quant side. And it was in the second year of the PhD program that someone said, I think that you're going to really get along with this guy, Pete Fader. He's a marketing professor, but it'd be worth the conversation. And so I went up there and spoke with him, and one thing led to another, and I really got hooked on the problem of predicting what customers will do. And it was pretty shortly after that, maybe about 6 months, that for one, we co-founded a company together using these predictive models on behalf of companies for their marketing departments. But then the other big thing was kind of connecting all those different areas, so statistics, finance, and marketing, bringing them together into this customer-based way of thinking about corporate valuation. And that ended up being my dissertation. So even though I finished with the PhD in statistics, half of my PhD committee were marketing people and half of them were statistics people. And then I ended up hitting the marketing job market and becoming a formal marketing professor. So it was, it doesn't sound like it would make sense, but somehow at least makes a little bit of sense to me. Yeah. Maybe it's rationalization.
I can see some connections there. Yeah, for sure. Very different running and co-founding, for that matter, a company versus teaching students about marketing. How do you balance those two things?
Just not having a whole lot of other hobbies is just really hard.
Okay, those are your hobbies.
Yep. Yeah. So so Pete and I, we co-founded Zodiac, which again was a predictive analytics software as a service firm, where you can think of it as basically automatically ingesting a company's transactional data and all their CRM data, spitting out projections of what the customers will do. That will kind of roll up into customer lifetime valuation estimates, and using that to help the marketers decide who to target with the next mailer, that sort of a thing. So we were backed by some leading VC firms like First Round Capital. We grew it and sold it to Nike in March of 2018. And then the following month, we took some of the proceeds and used it to co-found a second company together. So, so this company is called Theta. Because of the non-compete that we had in place with Nike, we couldn't pursue marketing use cases. It kind of is very understandable. So we focused 100% on customer-based corporate valuation, which was the topic of my dissertation. And so our client base was mostly financial services firms, mostly private equity firms.
So those valuations, especially customer lifetime value, is that across subscription and retail and all industries, or is that focused on subscription?
It's both. Yeah. So
Okay.
we do a lot of engagements with both subscription and non-subscription firms. As you can imagine, the modeling tends to be easier with the subscription firms, and that's I think part of the nice thing about subscription firms is you have more forward-looking visibility into what your customers are going to do. And
Right.
so, so we'll do both, but I would say that it's a little bit more shooting fish in the barrel with subscription. And so counterintuitively, more of our business will come on the non-subscription side, because that is oftentimes when it's perceived to be more difficult to come up with, those valuation numbers.
Yeah. Interesting. So counterintuitive, but why do you think that is perceived to be more difficult? And one thing, just from my experience, there tends to be quite a few people at subscription-based companies focused on exactly that, predicting their customers and what they will do, whether, across a lot of different areas. But is it because in non-subscription, there aren't as many people focused on that?
Yeah, it's a bit harder because you don't get to observe when customers churn. And so, there's kind of a lot of, more basic ways of looking at the cohort retention curves and just using that to kind of project out, well, if I know what customer acquisitions is going to be, I can see all of these customer retention curves across cohorts. So that can be a pretty decent view of what the future customer, retention curves might look like. And then typically, because it's a subscription business, the amount that you get paid every period while customers are with you, that also tends to be a lot more stable over time.
Right.
So you can kind of bolt those different pieces together and have more confidence in what revenue will be. At a non-subscription firm, again, for one, we don't actually get to observe any observable retention curve. We just get to see this flow of orders over time. And if a customer doesn't come back over the next 3 months, we don't know if that's because they decided that they don't like the firm permanently, or if they just happen to be a light buyer. And so, so that model, we've got a very good model for the non-subscription setting that deals with exactly that issue of, what we'll call latent retention, that we don't get to observe how many customers are with us. And then obviously, just to kind of round it out, the final thing we don't have that stability of revenue while customers are alive, because, in the holiday season, customers will place a lot more orders. In other periods, they'll place less. And the amount that they spend, especially if it's a business like Amazon, can be significantly different from purchase to purchase. So there's just all sorts of different ways that the problem becomes trickier. And so, I think that's why, especially if you're thinking about a growth private equity firm where, you're interested in the company, when you look at it through your usual investment yardsticks, it looks good. Now you've got 2 weeks and they've given you access to their transaction log. They just don't even know where to get started. And the fact that they have such a short amount of time to kind of figure out what all that means for their unit economics, they know it's important, but they just can't crunch the numbers in time. So, so that typically is, I think, part of the reason why, we'll see more interest, even though in both settings, we can do it. Actually, I think we can do it more effectively in a subscription setting.
I'm curious. Go ahead, Christy.
I actually have you seen, I'm assuming you have seen major shifts in trends with COVID. I know we've asked that question to a lot of people that have been on our podcast. With the amount of data and analytics you have, what are the major things that you've seen impacted, and how have you made recommendations to communicate with customers or keep the customer during COVID?
Yeah, I've done a lot of work on that, both academically and through Theta. So that's a problem that we've thought about a lot, and it shows up time and again in the engagements. And for one, it's something that can have different effects on each of those different behavioral processes that I mentioned. So early on in the restaurant delivery category, we saw this humongous spike in customer acquisition. But then it settled down very quickly, actually. But where we saw more enduring effects was in how many customers were active, their order frequency, and then even in the amount that was spent. But we've seen that the amount that's been spent, there was kind of this big bump, I think, as people were ordering restaurant delivery for dinner and for lunch the next day. That has started to settle back more into pre-pandemic, gravitating towards pre-pandemic levels. So I guess, the first major takeaway to me is it can have different effects on each of the processes. And so it's really important to kind of pull these different pieces apart to know, like, what is it that's changing in terms of how customers are interacting with my firm. But when it comes to the engagements, I wish I could say there was kind of a one-size-fits-all answer for how it's impacting company X versus Y. But as you can imagine, it's just so different from engagement to engagement that, we'll basically have this framework that says, in different periods of time, the orders process or the spend process or customer retention, they can be bumped up or down off of the baseline level. And we don't know if it's going to be good or bad, and we don't know which process, but we've got a lot of flexibility in terms of just being able to kind of detect what the effect is and build it into our projection of what's going to happen in the future. And so, so we've had companies that are on both sides of the spectrum. Obviously, e-commerce has generally been a beneficiary, but not always. And when you move out of e-commerce, they might be the ones who are getting battered by by COVID. So, so they want to know, are we seeing signs that we're kind of moving back towards, pre-pandemic levels or not? So it's a really hard question. There's been so many interesting examples too of analyses that we've done to just kind of prove out, like, is it enduring? Are we getting back to normal? And if things are looking really good right now, the big thing that investment firms are concerned about is, like, is this going to continue, or are we just getting massively faked out and, roll forward the clock a year? Are we going to be seeing like what we would have expected to see if the pandemic didn't happen? And the whole investment would fall apart, if that were to happen. So, so for the businesses that have, that sell to customers that live in different areas, and you've got their ship to address available, one thing you can do is you can basically look at patterns that are geography specific. So we've run a number of times analyses on, the New Yorks and the Californias of the world relative to the Texases and the Floridas of the world, and are we seeing signs of recovery in some geographies relative to others that would lead us to believe that that the increase in demand that we're seeing is more likely to persist versus not. So again, there's all sorts of ways that you can kind of tease that sort of information out, but it's tricky. But again, the good thing is typically, especially for e-commerce firms, the data is available to be able to run it. You just need to know how to kind of what numbers to crunch.
Nick, did you have another question I butted in earlier?
Well, I'm curious if there are trends that you're seeing across the different data sets that you're analyzing, maybe within industries or maybe across, that kind of point to customers behaving the same way through this pandemic, or are you seeing a lot of variation from, one merchant organization to the next?
Yeah, we did this big analysis on the whole restaurant delivery category. So a pretty big, it's a pretty big cross section of the economy. And you'd think, again, this is a category that you would expect would have this tremendous boost in demand, right? Because people are stuck at home, they can't go to the restaurant, they still want to have restaurant food. They're probably more time constrained, especially these days. And so there's just a lot of reasons why you would expect a more permanent kind of boost to demand there. But what's been interesting is, if you kind of try to break down the lift that we've seen in the restaurant delivery category, it's entirely due to pre-existing customers, people who had been in the category before COVID began. And in fact, first, new customer adoption it's below pre-pandemic levels.
Really?
Which is surprising now. Not obviously during the fever peak and March, April, but then the second thing that was fascinating to see that I would not have anticipated, I wouldn't have anticipated before I thought about it some more, is that the sort of repeat purchase behavior that we're seeing from cohorts that were born, say in the January, February, March timeframe of 2021, they're basically the same as we would have expected from customers born before COVID began. So basically, prospects are behaving as if COVID hasn't happened, and customers born during COVID are behaving as if COVID never happened. It's just the existing customers that have seen this fairly durable lift. Yes, I think one of the big general takeaways from that analysis, which I think applies more broadly, is that COVID, it basically was this big shock to the system. And the effect that it had was very different depending on whether you had been interacting with that category before the pandemic began or not. And in general, I think in a lot of different industries, the impact of COVID, it prompted a lot of people to enter, to try out new categories for the first time. But I think that the bigger effect was that it caused a lot of people who had been, like regular customers of a particular business to either ramp up or down the amount of times that they bought from that company. And one of the things that we know from the academic literature is that people form habits around things that they do very frequently. And so for something like health fitness, like your Peloton, or in the case of restaurant delivery, if you're ordering in, twice or three times a week, you're going to form habits around that. And so even if the external pressure that was kind of causing you to do more than you would have has gone away, that you'll still be kind of ordering at that elevated level because you formed a habit around it. And so it doesn't mean that habit's going to be permanent, but I think the effect of COVID, in some ways, it's more transitory than I would have thought, in the sense that it's not continuing to push on people to adopt. And people who adopted from in the middle of COVID, it's not pushing them to behave differently from pre-COVID customers, but it's also causing people to change more than I would have thought, in the sense that those existing customers, I think they can habituate around these new behaviors more than I'd anticipated.
Well, do you think it's because some consumers were trying to find ways just to use your shock to the system quote, we're trying to find a way to get by when everything changed? Like in the example of delivery, I was going to restaurants. I can't go to restaurants anymore. I don't want to cook every night. So I'm going to, bolt my delivery app and then try it for a while. And then maybe over time, things open back up. They want to get back to the way things were. So they didn't want necessarily to form a new habit. They were forced into doing it, and now really want to go back as much as they can to the whatever habit they had before. Do you see that happening? Or do you think this is pointing towards, no, habits change permanently?
Yeah, that's kind of the funny thing, at least in the case of restaurant delivery, that it's kind of both and, actually, which I hadn't expected. That people are showing signs, even though the kind of the shock of COVID has gone away, people are still ordering restaurant delivery much more than they had before. So that's true. But geolocation data also suggests that restaurant dine-in activity is back to where it was before the pandemic began. So people want to go back. They are going back, but they still like the convenience of restaurant delivery. And so they're still doing that at an elevated level too. I think what's getting crowded out in this case is cooking at home, that people are just not cooking at home as much. So now
again, was that people had to, and they did, and then got real sick of it and got used to ordering, through the app. And now that restaurants open back up, they're just like, I'm not going to go back to cooking as much as I used to. And I guess that's one hypothesis there anyway.
Yeah, I wish we had more visibility to be able to conclusively say that. But I think what we can say is restaurant dine-in, like people are physically dining in more or less as much as they had at the national level, obviously, variation from region to region. And restaurant delivery is still up above what we would have expected had there been no pandemic. So, some sense that actually is kind of a positive message for the restaurant category, that they can kind of have the cake and eat it too. Because I think there are a lot of people who had been concerned that restaurant delivery was 100% cannibalizing in on-premise dine-in visits, and I don't know necessarily that the data is 100% supporting that hypothesis.
Well, I know there was a lot of consumer and other people angst against the delivery companies even before the pandemic because of the fees that they charged and the markups and all that kind of stuff. And it felt like it was taking a lot away from the restaurants. And then the pandemic happened and these guys already had the infrastructure in place, and then they just got gasoline thrown on their fire. So then they took off and people were even more worried about it. But your data is pointing to, well, it can be additive to what you had before, provided that customers can't come back to the restaurants once again, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and certainly there's a whole other policy debate about the fees, and there's been a lot of hearings about capping commissions and things like that, and I've actually have testified publicly about it in New York. So it's certainly an issue that's pretty near and dear to my heart. But I think that in some sense the fees are maybe a separate issue, just making the economic model work for the restaurant. But in terms of consumer behavior, I think the restaurants can see both happen at the same time, as long as they're able to support that higher level of restaurant delivery demand at the same time that they're still now, trying to satisfy a full restaurant's worth of diners.
Right. Well, we could probably talk about that for a really long time, but I want to pivot a little bit to, I'm curious, looking under the hood of what you do in today's technology market. You're talking about going through massive sets of data, and everybody wants their analysis here and now. So what's without giving too much away, how do you guys, especially at Theta, make it happen? How are you working with a client who comes to you and says, "Hey, I love what you guys do. I want to take a look at this." Like, what's that process look like? And what technologies are you guys using today that enables you to do this, faster, more effectively?
Yeah, it's a great question. And thankfully, in that way, because the kind of computing environment is just so much better and easier now than it ever has been before, that you can take data sets that are 100 gigs or more and be able to run models on them very, very quickly. So, so the typical process for us is, client, assuming that they've kind of signed the contract, they'll typically have access to what's called the data room. And the data room is kind of where all of the data sits, all that transactional and CRM data. And, but it can kind of be available in a variety of different ways. And we don't want to make anything inconvenient for the private equity firm. So, so kind of whatever works for them, we can make it work for us. But what we'll kind of immediately do is, just leverage cloud computing. So spin up a whole bunch of different instances, and I have this notion of cohorting. We'll kind of do our analysis at the level of customer cohorts, where a cohort is defined as all the customers who are acquired within a certain specific unit of time. And so we'll kind of farm out the customer base to all these different cohorts that each can kind of run independent of the others. And that, again, makes it much easier to do all the computing, because we're not then running the models on 10 million customers simultaneously. It's actually much more bite-sized than that. I think the final piece is we've spent a lot of time and energy to make our code efficient. And it's a combination of coding everything up in low-level languages like C++ that run, they're just faster than more interpreted languages like R. And but then also coding it up efficiently. So there's better and worse ways of coding. And as a stats PhD, we spend a lot of time thinking about how we can be able to run the same operations, with less time. So so there's just a variety of different things that we can do. It really helps to have a stats PhD for some aspects of the problem, but I'd say the good thing is now most of the time when we think about the time it takes to complete an engagement, most of it's just understanding the data, making sure that the models validate well. We kind of have this predictive validation analysis that we do that leads us to say, we're confident that our models are predicting well here. And we do that for every engagement, but most of the time is being spent with that. Not a whole lot of time is being spent on the actual computation, which again speaks to the all those things that I was talking about a moment ago.
Right. How has that evolved even from when you started doing this?
It's even from relative to back in the Zodiac days. We think we kind of started the one and then immediately started the other. But 5 years have gone by, and 5 years, that's a long time. 5 years older, I got a little more gray hair on my head. Even relative to then, things have gotten better and better and better. So,
how quickly can you stand up? So I'm assuming you have different type of merchants that are coming to you with different type of customers, different type of data points and stats that they're looking for. So how do you drill down to getting that into your data analysis and your data model quickly in order to give them real-time feedback?
It's a good question. I mean, one of the things is the approach that we take. And I think we draw a pretty hard line between what we do and kind of a pure black box machine learning approach. So a lot of people, they sing praises. They sing the praises of machine learning and AI, and certainly I'm one of them. I know how to use those methods as well. But there's the question of when they're the most helpful, and the nice thing about the methods that we use is we squeeze as much signal as we can out of the raw transaction log. And it's really important from a data standpoint is you can have a gazillion different CRM variables, and from company to company, the CRM variables that you'll find in one can be very different from another.
Right.
But the transaction log, pretty comparable, who did what, when, and for how much. And that's pretty much it. So, there's still a lot of complexity, like, well, how do they book their returns? Is it a negative amount? Do they dock it back from the original order? Or, there's just a number of questions like that. And there's issues about how far back the data goes, and is it left censored? Do we have all of the transactional behavior, or do they roll off data that's older than 4 years? Et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
But it kind of creates a standardization that allows us to relatively quickly be able to go from not knowing anything about a company to having all of our models run for every single customer in their file.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. I mean, we work in payments and do a lot of conversions, right? Maybe from processor to processor or CRM to CRM, just moving that sort of data around. And especially when you're talking about legacy data, things that go back several years, there can be massive inconsistencies in the data and things that just do not make sense, which, we have to work with our clients to work through and figure out how to address. But I'm curious, when you're looking at it from a data analytics perspective, do you toss that data out? Do you just glean what you can from it? But do you get a lot of dirty data, or is it not really a problem?
The transaction log tends to be better than most of the other data sources. But that definitely does not mean that we don't regularly run into companies that have some issue or the other where we need to kind of get creative. So so that comes up with remarkable. I mean, it comes up a lot. So you gave the example, or you kind of alluded to it. Companies can transition from something to Shopify, or from Shopify to something else, and depending on how good they are with their data, can we match customers across the two different platforms? And that isn't always possible. And if it's not, then typically as long as the platform that was migrated to, as long as we can observe that for long enough, then I think it can be safe to ignore the older data for the sort of modeling that we'll do and the insights that we're looking to come up with. But yeah, it really is kind of a case by case sort of a thing. And we're working on an engagement right now where you can imagine if you sell a medical product, some doctors will refer patients to a website where they place orders directly, but some orders are placed in the office, and how the one is tagged versus the other, and for which orders you can actually see the end customer, and the end customer is identified. It's a real problem. And so we need to kind of think through, for cases like this, what can we do where maybe it's not the perfect answer, or maybe it's not everything that they're looking for, but it's a way to be able to get a good enough answer, and or to get an answer where even if it's not everything we would hope for, that we can reach valid conclusions.
Sure.
We won't get faked out, So that's oftentimes the game is like, well, what can we actually do? And it's where
the art comes in, greater than the science, or instead of science, or something that
I think that's where also there's other companies that can kind of purport to do similar things, but if you're not working with people who've seen literally 400 prior engagements and just live and breathe this stuff every single day, you could kind of end up screwed, because you're in this engagement, and you've got 2 weeks until you need to put in your bid. And if you find out 5 days in that, my vendor doesn't know what to do, you're stuck, because it's going to take you more than a week to find someone else. So in some sense, we think of ourselves like doctors, but one other way that we'll kind of think about ourselves is as an insurance policy. That there could be someone else out there who's a little bit cheaper than us, but we've got a bench like you couldn't believe. So if those weird situations with the hair on them come up, we can still kind of pull through where another team might have had difficulty.
Well, that value to the VCs who might be hiring you to, hey, I've got a short window here, and you've proven that you can make it happen and work through tough situations. I mean, I can't even speak to how valuable that is to them in those types of transactions.
Yeah. A little biased, but
Yeah. Well, I want to talk a little bit about your valuation process, kind of that methodology using a bottom-up approach by looking at the end customer. What led you to looking at it a different way, and talk about, of course, what that is?
I blame Pete Fader. Yeah, he's the marketing professor that it's in the second year of the stats program. So he'd spent the better part of 30 years predicting what customers will do. And there's this very well developed literature within the marketing science community for predictive models, where you take in all this transactional behavior and you use it to predict future transactional behavior. But oftentimes the use cases that they would pursue are like 100% marketing use cases, and so I think the dots that were connected is we're predicting what customers will spend, and if you had a model for what every customer will spend, and then you just summed up all of that spend within, like a 1 month period of time, that is total revenues for the company in that. Mm-hmm. So it's really this basic accounting identity that all the revenue that a company earns is coming from all the customers making purchases. And so if you have these great models that validate really well, we can use them for customer lifetime value. And obviously, there's a ton of diagnostic value to getting CLV and CLV to CAC and implied marketing return on investment, which we do, every time we run an analysis. But it kind of gives you for free a revenue forecast as well. Like it kind of has to. And so, so I think part of the that aha moment was basically figuring that out. and then showing that we can actually predict revenue more accurately, because we have these models that give us the ability to predict kind of the underlying behaviors that, when you kind of bring them together in the right way, give you revenue.
What the traditional approach, more top line, just look at trends and try to find deviation and then predict that out, compared to your more bottom up approach. Do these two things come together? I find it hard to believe that anyone's going to abandon the traditional approaches to valuation. But is this just another layer that helps inform that? And it seems like, and I think this is what you're talking about, that can then be used as an ongoing tool for outside of a equity transaction, to use to just everyday prediction of revenue and future cash flows. Is that what all of this is being used for?
Yeah, not only that, post acquisition, you can also use it for kind of managing value over time as well. It kind of brings you back to the marketing use cases. But yes, I think that in general, private equity firms, they've been doing valuation for many years, and we would be arrogant to say that we should just completely replace all that. And so,
right.
So I think that is also part of why I think this approach has taken off. While similar approaches within marketing that try to do a similar thing have not. I think one of the things that's made this approach work, while other related approaches within marketing they haven't taken off to nearly the same extent, is because we don't want to replace what that investment professional has been doing to come up with their valuation. When they do valuation, they either use something like a discounted cash flow valuation model, or they'll use some multiple of future revenue or EBITDA, or some measure of cash flow. And so what we're saying is, let's just leave that the way that it is, and all we're going to try and do is come up with this better way of informing that revenue forecast that drives the cash flow estimate. So if you were to think about it as basically discounted cash flow valuation, we're going to leave that DCF spreadsheet exactly the same as it was, but the only thing that we're going to do is we're going to come up with the revenue projection in this other way. And so we're just going to kind of replace what you had been doing for the top line forecast with this customer-based estimate, but then leave everything else the same. So I think that they've found that to be more amenable with how they look at the world. And I think it's allowed it to get more traction than other approaches that kind of dispense with how they think about valuation.
Do you think I don't want to say the value, but how they look at, the customer-based predictive analytics has been skewed because of the pandemic, like because so much is up in the air and no one can predict what even 2022 is going to be like. So does that make them a little leery of predicting what consumer behavior is going to be, say, before the pandemic?
Yeah, it's a great question. We, at the very beginning of COVID, I think we saw a decline in business, but there was a significant decline in the number of transactions that were happening.
Sure.
Very understandably so, because I think everyone was just wondering what's going to happen in the future. And so they kind of put a pause on their deals. I think since then, you're absolutely right that we've seen a lot of people who've come to us saying, we're looking at these revenue trends. They seem heartening, but we want to make sure we're not getting faked out by something because of COVID. And so we just want to know, how should we factor COVID into our decision-making process? And I think that on the whole has been a good thing. It certainly required a lot of work on our part to kind of optimize what we should do to understand how COVID has been factoring into consumer behavior. But I think now that we've kind of made that investment, it's been a net a positive for us.
Yeah. Well, in terms of subscriptions specifically, in the valuation process, like I said before, I think a lot of organizations have devoted quite a few resources to their own sort of predictive analytics to forecast cash and churn rates and attrition curves, everything around that. Do you see that your types of services and what Theta does as being additive to that, or does it replace things that they're already doing?
Yeah, oftentimes when they're running models like that, typically it's either to come up with kind of trophy figures that go in investment presentations that are purely backwards looking, or they're kind of relegated to the marketing department to understand, what the next best action is, or some other, kind of marketing use case. But we'll often find that the CFO has not seen these numbers. And also, I think there's a lot that goes into like what actually is customer lifetime value. And there's a lot of ways even people within marketing will kind of get it wrong. So, things like, well, what variable margin what margin should I use? We know that it's a profit-based figure, so we know we shouldn't get lifetime revenue. But what actually what should our contribution margin be? And there's a whole bookkeeping question around that. And same for CAC. It seems like, oh, well, it's the CAC. But what is CAC? And there's a lot of different opinions about that, about what should or should not be included in it. And so, I think, part of when we've kind of been speaking with investment firms and people on the finance side of the org, I think they still get a lot of value because that part of the process is very incremental, even if the modeling is not quite as incremental in that case.
Well, that I think that alone, you hit it right there. There's going to be a consistent approach that you guys apply to your analysis that's going to kind of supersede whatever that any individual organization might be doing on their own. I mean, we again see this all the time when we're talking about payments, especially recurring payments and a collection rate or pay through rate on those. You'd be surprised. Seems pretty black and white, right? But the different way organizations measure this and what goes into that calculation can actually vary a lot. So sometimes you don't realize you're talking about apples and oranges. Do you see that, or is that one of the values that your clients get out of an engagement with you?
Yeah, and because the investment firms, obviously the companies being invested in, they're incentivized to paint themselves in the best possible light. You don't. Right. It's hard to fault them for that, but the key then is for the investment firm to be able to kind of see the signal through the noise. And and for something like a contribution margin, you talk about payments. Some companies, that they won't deduct payment processing from their contribution margin, even though every time a new dollar comes in, some fraction of that is going to be going away as payment processing.
Right.
We've seen companies that don't include fulfillment expenses in their contribution margin. But again, it's like, every time I ship a product, I'm going to be spending my fulfillment expenses. So I got to put that in. And so you need someone who on a very short clock can be able to kind of offer best practices about, the bookkeeping. It sounds so mundane, but, if you haven't been doing this and you don't have a whole lot of time to think it over, I think it's surprisingly easy to kind of, to trip up a little bit. I think the other thing when you speak about consistency is it allows for comparability across companies. If you didn't have a consistent approach, then when you're looking at company A versus company B, it's kind of apples versus oranges because of the definitions. And so we can have this consistent definition across companies that allows us to be able to say, this company scores very highly relative to the universe of other engagements that we've done. They've got a very good contribution margin, or their CAC is very low for the industry that they're serving. And you really can't even do that if CAC is being defined 10 different ways for 10 different companies.
Right. For sure. Well, I'm so many more questions left on the table, but we don't want to take up all of your time today, Dan. If anyone listening today has questions for you, wants to learn more about Theta, where can they go?
LinkedIn and Twitter, those are big platforms for me. So I'm constantly posting on both social media. So D_McCarr, MCCAR on Twitter. And Daniel McCarthy, Emory, hopefully will pull me up on LinkedIn. ThetaCLV.com is our website. So that's just THETA-CLV. I think between one of those three, hopefully we'll be able to reach you.
Yeah, they can find you. Yeah. Awesome. Well, again, thanks so much for the time today, Dan. Really appreciate the conversation and learning about what you guys are doing, and best of luck.